Hello dear viewers, my name is Tom Weber and welcome back to another video. Next year sees the release of my first English poetry collection, Halfway to Blossoming Scribbles of a Mind in Slumber. And in honor of that and to celebrate it a little bit for me as well as for you, my readers, I thought it might be a good and fun idea to look back on the books that I've already written, most of them in German, so this is also a video to catch up some of you who may be experiencing my literature, my poetry for the very first time. And so I wanted to do this little introduction video into what I've written so far. And for those of you who may speak German and who have read some of my books before, it will just be a little bit of a recap, looking back on the journey so far and preparing you for this new release. And I'm also going to say a few words about this new book at the end of this video. So without further ado, we're going to start right at the beginning with this book right here. This was called Mondscheinsonette or Moonlight Sonnets in English. It was my very first published book. It was published in the Georg von Treuberg Verlag in Germany. And as the name implies, sonette or sonnets in English, this was a collection of sonnets. The sonnet, for those that may not be aware, is a poetry form, and its most basic rule is that the poem has to consist of 14 lines. So as soon as your poem has exactly 14 lines, you could basically call it a sonnet. There's a few bits here and there which you can add to that, but that's the basic rule. So you have a sonnet with 14 lines. And so I was actually inspired to write this particular book by the French form of the sonnet, which was popularized by such poets as Charles Baudelaire or Paul Verlaine during the 19th century, during the symbolist movement. I'm thinking here of Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal, which had a very big influence on me and which inspired me to write some of these poems. So much for the background, but now let's actually try and describe what's in this book, and I'm going to do my best to give you somewhat of an explanation. So what I basically tried to do in this book is describe the awakening of the artist. It was my first published book, and so I wanted to describe the process that I felt I was going through myself. But what I tried to do in this entire book is that there's no first person used, so there's no I in it except for the very end. But mostly in this book there's a third person that is described from the outside, from a third person perspective. And I found that idea interesting, and so I experimented with it, and I really liked the effect that it created in this book, this distance effect and this feeling of sort of passive writing and passive experience that you get as a reader from the poems. As I read it just now, just to get it back into my mind, and I think that I actually managed to do that. I hope so. But yeah, so it's the awakening of the artist, which was described in here, and which actually prepared the ground for my next books. Fast forward a year and we have a next book. It was this one, Glaswand or Wall of Glass, Glass Wall. This was the follow-up to Mondscheinsonette. And firstly, what was different about this book is that this was my first self-published book. So you remember the first one, Mondscheinsonette, was published in a publishing house. But from my experience, mostly because I felt like I needed to retain personal control of how I would present my work. And so I worked myself into the details, found a company with which I could cooperate to publish my own books. And so this book is entirely designed, layout is done completely by myself. And I'm really, to this day, I think that Glaswand so far is my best work. It's my personal opinion. I really like the layout of the book. I like the style that I went for. I'm trying to get some close-ups of this book so you can see the difference between the sonnets in Mondscheinsonette and the poems in Glaswand. The idea was entirely different. While I said that in Mondscheinsonette I tried a third-person perspective, here in Glaswand very much it is a personal experience, and it is from a first-person's point of view. And so obviously the style had to change from the more classical yet modern look of the sonnets. I went for a quite minimized style, I went for a quite sterile style, and this was also the choice I made when designing the book. The book is very bland in some ways. There's not much in it because the style of these poems is just very fractured. But I felt that this was very appropriate for the theme of the book. And now Glass Wall prepared this sort of analysis that I tried to lay out with this book. While Mondscheinsonette prepared it, glaswand is the experience of it, the experience of a world behind a glass wall, the experience of a world where so much seems within your reach, but still it is impossible to get there. And that kind of thematic and that kind of struggle was very much of interest to me at the time. This book, which was published in 2017, and so it explores this world, these different perspectives behind this glass wall and the glass wall itself in some points of view. There's 55 poems in Glaswand. They are divided into 3 categories this time. The first one I would describe as more oriented towards the world in which this book plays. The middle part is an experiment that I did at the time, which was called #lyric, or #poetry in English, and which was to write poems with exactly 140 characters, which was the limit that Twitter imposed to you at the time. Why did I do that? Just because I thought it would be interesting to challenge myself, to say, well, in today's world we are so often limited in our expressions, and social media we are very often limited in how many words we can use and how much space we are given to express our views. And so I tried, is it possible to, in just 140 characters, to bring something meaningful across and maybe break some linguistic barriers? And I tried to do that, and I think it worked out quite well. I really like that style of writing. And then the last part of this book is about personal connections and personal collections involving glass walls. And speaking of personal connections, this actually brings us to my next book. It was in the year 2018 that I published this right here. Now, this is not a poetry collection. This was my first step at prose writing, and this is actually a novella. So the genre of the novella is not very much known in England. It is best known, I believe, in Germany. And just to explain it a little bit, what makes it different from a novel? Firstly, the length. For a novel, usually you would expect a book over 200 pages. And a novella is shorter than that. But then there's also some restraints that apply to the storytelling of a novella versus a novel. So a novella is very much relying on symbolism. It is a metaphorical story throughout, and it usually follows just one single plot point, while in a novel you might have several. And so what I wrote here is a novella. It is a novella that plays in Venice. The plot revolves around 2 figures. The first one is Tito Monteiro Rossi. The second is called Anya Reichelkier. The plot follows their personal relationship and the development of that relationship. Without getting too much into the plot, I want to explain to you a little bit what was my thought process behind writing this book. I wrote it pretty much after finishing Glaswand. And what I basically tried to do is take that idea of the poems in Glaswand, which I just described, this life behind the glass wall, and illustrate it with a story of 2 individuals and how they perceive the world. Now, looking back at Charons Barke today, by the way, this book was also published in a French translation called La Barque de Charon. So if any French speakers are listening, you might also want to read it in French. But to get back to the book, looking back at it now, it is very interesting to me to read it again and to read some of the plot points again. And what's interesting is that I've always thought that the great thing about literature is that it speaks differently to everyone. So every reader will have a different experience of the book. But I find that also as an author myself, I experience my books differently with each year that passes. I get a different perspective and I get a little bit more out of it, and I get to know the characters in a different way. I feel like when I look at Tito today and Anya, I see more in them. I see even more in their story than I thought I'd seen before. If I haven't mentioned before, this is a love story, or at least it tries to be. But it is not a usual kind of love story, I don't think, at least. I think this is a very particular relationship that these 2 have. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to do so. I've heard a lot of positive feedback from readers, which I'm very happy about. And to this day, I'm very happy that I managed to write this prose book. Prose is still something that I struggle with a little bit. I am a poet at heart, and so my next book is also going to be a poetry collection again. But I do want to write more prose in the future. I just, the right story needs to really grip you for that. But yeah, that's Charons Barke. And the last book that I published was something quite different. So let's have a look at that. So, and here we are with the last book of mine, which was published this year. So very recent, it was this one. Ultreya will be fine. Two friends on their Camino to Santiago. And now this is not really a fictional story. This is actually the journal notes that I wrote during my pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, which I did this year in June and July with a friend of mine, Joe. Some of you may have followed us on Instagram. We had an account, Tom Joe Camino 2019, and we raised money for charity while we were on the Camino. We managed to raise about, it's somewhere in this book, the exact sum. Here it is. We managed to raise 737 euros and 75 cents, which was just amazing. And we're still continuing to raise money with each copy of this book that we sell, because we're donating everything that we might be making from this to the German rescue organization CI, which is really great. And this book was again something very different for me, because as you know, I published the books myself. And for this book, I wanted to do something very different. Because I only had these journal notes to go off, there was obviously not enough text to make a traditional book. And so I thought, because we also had so much photos and so much different mediums of memories of this story, I thought it might be interesting to make more of a visual book. I tried to learn Adobe InDesign, which I managed to do, and which helped me a lot in the creation of this particular book to make it visually appealing. That's also one of the reasons why it is a little bit more expensive than most of my books. This book right here would cost you about just over 30 euros, but that is because it is printed on high quality photographic paper. A lot of work went into it in a very short amount of time, because I needed to get it published within 2 months of us coming back from the Camino, so it was really a bit of a rush to get it out. And currently I am working on the German translation of this book, which I'm also doing myself, and which will be published hopefully in spring next year. And so this was also in English. So for the English speakers watching, if you haven't read it already, order this book, do something great, donate to charity by buying it, and read Joe and my story from the Camino. It was really an amazing adventure. The Camino was something very special, and I think if you read this book, this will come across. But so, with this book, we have now finished talking about the past books that I published, and now I want to talk a little bit about the future. So, in January of 2020, I will publish my very first English poetry collection. The book is called Halfway to Blossoming: Scribbles of a Mind in Slumber. And so I walked you through the main ideas of my past books. And what I set out to do with this new book was, well, several things. I tried to cap off this first journey of mine. I would say that the books that I've shown you, these here, maybe with not counting the Camino book because that was special, but these first literature books, the novella and the two poetry collections, they were part of what I would describe as a first arc of me as a writer. And why would I say that? Because I think that all these books are connected by a sort of same idea that goes through them. There was the start, the awakening of the artist and the artistic creation. Then we moved on to describing the world surrounding the artist. Then we moved on to a concrete story over this reality. And now with Halfway to Blossoming, we are going to continue with these questions, but I think that you are actually going to get some solutions, some resolve from this new book, because there are new ideas in this, and that was very important to me. I don't want to publish books where I have the feeling that I repeat myself. That's why it took some time for my next poetry collection, and that's why the novel came first and the book about the Camino. Because for my next poetry collection, I wanted to give you something more. I feel like not only do I owe it to myself, but also to you as readers, because obviously you're not interested in just reading the same things over and over again. And so I wanted to publish a book when I thought I had something new, something fresh to offer you. And I wanted to write an English book for the longest time. I had the Camino book, of course, that was in English, and it was sort of warming up for this newest publication. But Halfway to Blossoming is now a proper poetry collection in English, completely written in English. There's just one poem in it that was originally written in Serbian by me, and then I translated it into English, but it fits so well into this first section of the book that I just had to include it. So Halfway to Blossoming will be a mixture of poems that I published before on my social media accounts, mainly on Instagram and my blog that I previously had, and there will be completely new ones. There will be just over 30 poems in this new book. The style is somewhat similar to that one that I used in Glaswand, but I think there's also going to be some new elements in it from a stylistic point of view. Content-wise, the book is called Halfway to Blossoming, so not quite there, but on the way to something growing, something blossoming. And it is, when I compare it to my past books, I think it is a positive note, which is unusual for me, as those of you know that read my books, because usually I'm a very grim, gloomy poet. Lots of my poems, I had some people say to me, were a bit gloomy from time to time, but I think if you criticize that before, you're going to enjoy Halfway to Blossoming. But there's also some dark bits in there, so don't worry if you enjoyed particularly that. There's going to be new elements. There's is going to be a sort of Buddhist element that's coming through it. For those of you that haven't noticed that, on my social medias, over the past year, I've become a practicing Buddhist, so of course those ideas are also going to flow into this new book. I'm very excited for you all to discover it. It's going to be out in January. I don't know quite the exact date yet, but it's going to be about mid-January. Follow me on my socials, mainly at weber.tom55 on Instagram. It's my most active account, and you're going to be kept in the loop about this new book. As I mentioned before, I think that the great thing about literature, and I'm being proven that every day, is that we all get something out of it, and something very individual, something very personal. Books, to me, writing them and reading them, they are like distilled drinks, like a fine whiskey or something. You know? A lot of work went into them, and you get this insane aromas. You get this tasting experience, which is so powerful and so different and so individual to each one of us. There's these stories that these books, some stories they tell for everyone, but there's always something very personal in it. That taste you get the first time, and then something emerges from your past or from deep within your soul, and it's just a very personal connection that you feel at that point with a certain book. And that's the great thing about them. What stories might these books tell you? If you haven't found out yet, maybe it's time to consider buying some of them. Sly advertisement from me here. But yes, thank you very much for listening and watching this video. It really gave me great pleasure talking about the books, looking back at them, especially considering the new one coming up. Thank you so much for your attention. Follow me on Instagram, weber.tom55, where I usually keep very much up to date, and I also like to respond if you have any questions. And I'm really looking forward to speaking with you again in my next video. Goodbye.